Hello everybody, I'm an Australian businessman in Vietnam and I thought I'd make this short video just to contribute my part to thoughts about the global economic crisis. I think there will be a global economic collapse. I think that's inevitable now. People talk about the cause being the crisis in real estate in the US. Well, maybe that's an immediate cause, but I think in order to really understand the problem, we also need to look at some of the really longer term underlying causes, and there are many. I propose that some of these could be such as the fact that the European Union was really always unsound. And it was because they let countries such as southern European countries, including Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, into the economic union when quite frankly they did not reach the criteria needed in order to qualify as a member. And once they were in, the Maastricht Treaty, which did outline ways and methods that, or standards that people had to reach or countries had to reach in their economy, those standards outlined were not enforced. And so the problem, which is now apparent to us, has been allowed to get worse and worse and worse over a number of years. Basically, people want free lunch and they want others to pay for it. It's really as easy as that. I find just as a simple businessman that whether a problem affects a person, a company, a corporation or a country, basically the problem is similar, it's just the magnitude varies. And while a country can last a lot longer than a person if it spends more than it earns, when it does fall, it falls a lot harder and the fall lasts a lot longer and has many more ramifications. Another long-term cause I feel is the complete myth of the American dream. Initially at the turn of the century, maybe the American dream was a reality, if a dream can be a reality, a bit of a contradiction. But I think people need aspirations and they need vision, and dreams contribute to those things. But I think since that time, the America as a land of plenty has been increasingly become a land of plenty for only a few. And the average hard-working American has been exploited by means of jingoistic patriotism and this myth of the American dream that everybody can share the wealth. They can't, because the politics in America are controlled by big multinational corporation lobby groups. Then there's the myth of terrorism. What a huge threat that is. Isn't it strange that terrorism suddenly grew to be such a huge factor only after the fall of the Soviet Union when the Cold War disappeared? Those people who sold munitions and lived off the profits of war suddenly needed a new enemy. And what better than to create one, the one of terrorism? Who was Osama bin Laden anyway? A raghead living in a small villa in Pakistan? Did this man really control Al-Qaeda? Did he really? What sort of communications would he have had? Look what it takes the White House to control the American Armed Forces. And Al-Qaeda was also a worldwide global organisation, supposedly. This myth was created by people who wanted to sustain the arms production and the militarism that's going on in the world today. Of course, once they start oppressing people, then those people tend to fight back. It's just human nature. If you take away someone's land, he's going to fight back, and one action begets another. But it's just very strange that terrorism only really arose as soon as the Cold War ended. It was the new enemy. Another long-term cause is the loss of discipline and standards in the West. I live a lot in third world or developing countries, as the euphemism goes, and I have a saying, the three words that distinguish a developing country from a developed one are discipline, organisation and maintenance. Where's the discipline gone from the West? Where are the high standards? Where are the work ethics? They've gone. And along with that has gone a lot of the organisation and maintenance of the infrastructure. I mean, just look at the US. I don't want to pick on the US, but because it's such a high profile, it's an easy one to draw example from, which we can all readily identify with. The US still uses Fahrenheit measurement. It still has imperial measure, feet and inches, pounds. The whole world, apart from Myanmar, uses metric. Myanmar and the United States are the only countries today in the globe that use exclusively imperial measure. Now that's got to say something about the US. The US has not maintained its systems, and therefore how can it remain competitive in the world today? The world no longer has to beat a door to America, and they'll pay the price. If you don't maintain, countries and companies either go up or they go down. They never stay level. If you don't maintain your systems, if you don't have discipline, if you don't have organisation, then you will go down. Last of all, and I think the biggest cause of today's problem is the Zionist movement in Israel, which has really been responsible for many of the world's problems. I just don't want to Israeli bash here, but I've been a peacekeeper there on 2 tours, and I served with the Israeli military, the Egyptian military, the US 82nd Airborne, 101st, on attachments. And I have to say, I went there like most people, very pro-Israel in the cause, but I must say that nearly everyone left anti-Israel in the cause because of the huge injustices we saw during our tour in Israel and in Egypt in the Sinai Desert. And I think that this has really caused a lot of the problems, as I say, in the world today. But anyway, so therefore, if we look at this problem, we need to understand the immediate cause, which is probably best allocated to the US collapse of the real estate values, but also we need to keep in mind the long-term causes. Like companies, countries need growth. Growth comes from investment. Investment only comes from equity investment or debt from borrowings. The problem is the equity investment in the stock markets today are just speculation. That's why the stock market's going up and down, up and down, up and down. It's like a billy cart going down the hill that's increasingly going from side to side to side to side with bigger gyrations until finally it will just flip over. So equity is like the days of the Great Depression, or just before it, the days of the crash in October 29, where it's increasingly speculative. People are not investing because they believe in the companies. They're not investing for the long-term gain. They're investing to make quick profit because they can do so because of all the electronic gadgetry that allows that to happen. Also, there are very big funds involved, which they weren't in the old days, and these funds, when they chop and change, cause big influence and big gyrations on the equity market, which makes it very unstable. Of course, that leaves the debt market. Well, the debt market's dead, as we know, so therefore bringing just austerity to cut debt is not enough. Because if you cut debt, equities, no one's investing, how do you get growth? Unless you get growth, you cannot power out of the problem. That's why I think the problem is not fixable. We will go into a very, very severe recession, if not in fact a depression. I don't think the recession or depression will be inflationary at all. People talk about the Weimar Republic and all the printing of money. Well, frankly, folks, the Deutschmark in those days was not the world currency. At one stage, I think, along with many others, I did think that the world currency would be changed from the US dollar and maybe go to the euro. But that's not going to happen now. It's not going to go to the Chinese yuan either. That means it's going to remain with the US dollar. People need the US dollar to trade as a world currency. They need the US dollar to buy oil. They need the US dollar to buy gold, etc. So as soon as the stock market looks bad, what happens? Everybody rushes straight to the US Treasury bonds. To buy bonds, you need US dollars. They buy US dollars. It immediately pushes up the value of the US dollar. So the value of the US dollar, even though there's money printing going on like Billio, or has been and probably will be with the quantitative easing 3, the US dollar has really maintained its value. This has made it very hard for the US economy, of course, because it's harder to export, it's harder to be competitive when everyone in the world is madly trying to deflate their currencies in order they can be more competitive and export more goods. So really bizarre things happening. Usually when a country goes well, its currency goes up, but in fact, the US, which is not doing well, has its currency going up. I mean, how bizarre is that? And that's what makes it so difficult for people or economists or policymakers to fix the economy. In fact, it's not fixable. So if we go, you look at the signs that the economy is telling us. We are going into a very hard deflation, and that is going to that is the hardest type of recession to go into. Unemployment will rise, people in productive industries will close, asset prices like real estate will fall, and these sort of deflationary depressions are extremely hard to get out of, because the whole of the economy has to be re-geared. Look at Japan. Japan has really not recovered from its deflationary recession of the 1990s. So, but in a Great Depression, or in a depression, many people get wealthy. Kenneth Galbraith, a famous economist, pointed this out, that even in the Great Depression, only 35% of people lost their jobs, but they were among the most productive people in the world's economy. People like government employees, lawyers who were needed to sort out all the problems, receiver managers, etc., all kept their jobs. They earned income. Assets fell dramatically in price, and people who kept their income could borrow money at zero interest rates and buy up all the assets. Even in Greece today, we see unemployment high, but the unemployment is mainly among the productive people. Hardly a government person has lost his job in Greece. It's a socialist country, government employee. Why should he lose his job? This is what happened in the Great Depression, and that's why the world didn't recover from the Great Depression for 10 years. Well, it's one of the reasons, there are many reasons, but it's a major reason. The world only recovered when there was a war on. I think we'll reach a crisis in about February 2012. 2012 is going to be a momentous year in the world. By May, I think there's a very high possibility, I'd say at least 75%, that the world will go into a very hard deflationary recession, if not a depression. This will cause a great deal of social unrest, because with media like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc., the average person's not going to sit still. These movements are already occurring on a small scale, with such as the Occupy Wall Street movement. They will occur on a big scale, and politicians who lacked political will have to act. I visited New York City in May 2008, and I was shocked what I saw. I saw America heading into a very bad recession then. I came back to Vietnam, where I currently live, and said to people here, you don't know what's coming, we're going to be hit by an economic tsunami. Unless the world generates demand immediately, we're really going to be suffering. And I thought, well, what sort of demand could we generate immediately if no one's really investing? Well, and sadly, the only demand really is caused by war. The Second World War pulled us out of the Great Depression. Excuse me. It really wasn't until about 1944 that the world reached its full economic capacity. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the West could afford a big war now, but it could if it was funded by the Gulf states, as were the First and Second Gulf War, of which I was a commentator on the news for in Australia. These wars were funded by the Gulf states, and I think there's a very high possibility that there will be an active campaign against Iran, which is a Shiite Muslim state, hated by the Sunnis, especially by the Saudis and the Kuwaitis. And I think there's a very good chance that there will be a campaign against Iran. I said that this should have happened in June 2008 in order to save us from recession. Of course, this may seem a very cold-hearted view, but I was speaking purely economically. But there wasn't the political will to do so, so people kept borrowing and continuing on and building up the levee banks of debt on the river of economic catastrophe. And now we've reached there, the banks are bursting, and so the politicians, to save their skin from the social unrest, will probably now swing into action. Why is NATO in Libya? Why is NATO in Afghanistan? What has this got to do with NATO? Sure, it keeps NATO going when the Cold War is over and there's no real need for it, but maybe it's match training. Maybe it's been match training all this time for a strike against Iran. Israel always gets its way. The Saudis and the Gulf state would not fund a war against Iran if the Israelis were involved. That's one reason why the Israelis were not involved in the First and Second Gulf Wars. But of course, Israel will be the big game, be the big winner from this. They will sit back laughing while the West does its job, and it's funded by the Sunni Arab states. If you look back in history, you'll see that the 50s was a boom period because of the end of the Second World War and the Korean War. The 60s was a boom period because of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War really ended. The Americans withdrew its ground forces in '71. I was at the military college at that time, just graduating, from having trained for 4 years for war in Vietnam and then graduated to a peacetime army and had no career. So I remember the dates well. So the Vietnam War ended in '71, and lo and behold, the '70s was a depressed decade. It reached its crisis, the critical crisis of that depression in the very bad recession of 1982. What brought us out of that? Well, lo and behold, the Iran-Iraq War, which was funded again by the Gulf states. Who cared if Iranians and Iraqis were killing each other? No one cared. The West plied Iraq with weapons, Soviet Union plied Iran with weapons, and everybody was happy. Finally, the war ended in '88. What happened? Well, the Soviet Union immediately went bankrupt and collapsed, and America came near to it because California had become nothing but an arms industry. Why didn't America collapse? Japan went into recession, which caused a very bad recession in Australia because Japan was Australia's main trading partner at that stage. China had not emerged. Well, the reason America didn't was because it had the stimulus of the small wars of the First and Second Gulf Wars, and also all the Japanese savings, which were getting a 0% return in the Japanese recession of the early 90s, which has persisted to this day, went straight across to America and fueled the dot-com boom in the American share market. So America was spared the depths of the recession. It did have some recession, but not the depths of the recession that were experienced in many other countries, including Australia. And therefore, it didn't learn its lessons. It didn't learn the hard lessons we in Australia learned from that recession. So what's going to happen? We go into a hard recession, social unrest, war against Iran. What else is going to happen? What's Russia going to do at this time? Who knows? If we strike Iran, Russia's always been an ally of Iran. It supplies nuclear technology, we know. It supplied arms during the Iran-Iraq war. What will Russia do if a country on its border is attacked by the West? More importantly, what will China do? China's an ally of Iran. It's a major trader, also introducing nuclear technology, no doubt. I think what China will do, China right now is building up its infrastructure in many countries. It's getting its resources wherever it can in the globe. It's going to countries which have been ignored by the West, South America, Brazil, virtually ignored by the West for all its fabulous resources. It's going to Africa, many countries in Africa. So how does it get all of these goods back to its industries? Well, it has to have trade, it has to have shipping, and therefore it has to have protection of sea routes. How can China do this? How can a country be a global power without a blue water navy? Well, of course it will have one. It's presently bought the old Soviet aircraft carrier, not the old one, but the one that wasn't finished it, and it's going to train people, its crews on how to operate the aircraft carriers, and it's building another 4, I hear. But it needs ports for these. Every country needs every superpower rather needs a blue water navy, and therefore they need ports. Where will it get these ports from? Well, unbeknown to many, China's building these in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan. So it will control, well, not control, but have a lot of influence in the Indian Ocean. For many, many years or generations, the Soviets or the Tsarists, and then the Soviets tried this because their fleet was isolated between Archangel and Vladivostok, the two ends of the earth. They never really had an influence in the Indian Ocean. They tried to get one through the port of Aden, but that never really succeeded. So they always wanted an Indian Ocean port, but the Chinese also need one, particularly since so many of their commodities come from Africa and will increasingly do so. So it's building ports in Pakistan and it's building ports in Sri Lanka, both Muslim countries, by the way. But also it needs more than that. How about Vietnam? How easy would that be? Vietnam is a very long extended coastline. It's got good major ports. It used to be under Chinese domination for 1,000 years. China really looks upon Vietnam as a province, a long lost province. Not so longly lost, actually. The original language of Vietnam was Chinese. It still has the Chinese script. It was only changed much later by the French when in their colonial days in the 19th century. So China tried invading Vietnam again to punish it when Vietnam removed Pol Pot. It invaded Vietnam through the traditional northeastern route in 1979, but it was unsuccessful. Why? Mainly because it was inexperienced, and at that time the Vietnamese army was a veteran army, even though most of it was in Cambodia at the time, and it was able to defeat the Chinese and inflict severe losses on the Chinese just using second-grade railway troops. So what will China do? Well, China's already thought of that, and for years it's been developing very big logistics and infrastructure projects in Laos, on the other side of Vietnam. It really owns Laos now. Already it's got casinos in the Golden Triangle around Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, which distract the Laotian officials and pay them off, no doubt. But really it's building very big infrastructure, water reservoirs and programs in Laos. It'll come through the back door. It will do a Ho Chi Minh Trail on Vietnam and come in through the northwest, not just the northeast. If it takes Vietnam, invades Vietnam, for all its fantastic food resources in the Mekong River, its fantastic mineral resources in the north, and its Pacific Ocean ports, who's going to help Vietnam? In the old days, China was always worried when it invaded Vietnam in '79 that the Russians might do something and it would face a two-front war. Does it face that danger now? I doubt it. Are the Americans going to come back to Vietnam? Hardly. Is Europe in its present state going to do anything? Unlikely, most unlikely. Is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a trading bloc, going to help Vietnam? Won't happen. Already Cambodia and Laos are increasingly coming under Chinese dominance. So who's going to help Vietnam? Well, the answer is nobody. China will succeed in taking over Vietnam. It will establish a blue water navy port, establish a blue water navy, and within a decade China will become not the main superpower, but certainly a rival superpower to the US. In the next 20 years it will be the dominant superpower. So you see, the present economic crisis is just not one of economics, it's one of social and political upheaval as well. 2012 will be looked upon, like the year I think 1848 was in Europe, as a momentous year of great political change and great power change. But this time it won't be just in Europe, it will be in the world. Thank you for listening.